The Milltown Reservoir is the wetland area created by the confluence of the Clark Fork and Big Blackfoot rivers. It provides habitat for local wildlife and recreational opportunities for area residents. The reservoir also contains toxic sediments that contaminate drinking water and threaten downstream wildlife habitat. This is the story of Milltown Reservoir and the communities around it. It is a story full of complexities and controversies. Jeff Smith of the Clark Fork Pend Oreille Coalition discusses some issues concerning the reservoir.
Milltown Dam has been a Superfund since the early 80s, and what happened out there is there has been a century of hard rock mining up in Butte, the huge copper mine, the Berkeley Pit, folks are probably familiar with. Well, that mining work began in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and continued well into the mid-1900s. But in 1907, a dam was built in Milltown to generate power and electricity for the mill that was there in Bonner. And as the contaminated tailings and material began to wash downstream from the mines up in Butte, this new dam created a reservoir, and it allowed a lot of those contaminated sediments and tailings to wash downstream and to settle out into the reservoir itself. And what has happened since then is those contaminated tailings, those contaminated sediments have now poisoned the drinking water supply in Milltown with arsenic and some other contaminants, most notably copper and zinc.
ARCO is primarily an oil and gas company. We produce oil out of the ground, we sell gas, make gasoline in refineries. In the late 1970s, we opted to diversify into another business, and what seemed logical at the time was to get into hard rock mining. So in 1977, we purchased all of the assets of the Anaconda Mineral Company, including their operations here in Montana, and I guess found that we couldn't operate them any more effectively than the previous owners had, and a lot of that had to do with just price of copper. At the time, it was at a very, very low level. So we only operated the facilities for somewhere between 3 to 5 years, depending on which of the facilities we're talking about, and shut them down in the early 80s, and of course, woke up one morning and found out we had inherited an incredible amount of liability, particularly environmental liability from the preceding owners.
Before there was mining in Butte and Anaconda, mining and smelting, and the river was trashed, there used to be probably pretty prosperous fur bearer population up there, you know, beaver, otters, mink. You don't find them up there anymore. So there's just all different sort of levels of the food web up there have been affected by this metals contamination, from aquatic insects to the fish that eat them to the things that eat the fish, mink, for example, otters. All this stuff's been hurt.
Wildlife is, as I mentioned, these long ongoing studies. Wildlife was one that they looked very closely at, and they did take some samples of fish. They've taken bagged a few birds so they could look at the tissue and everything. And by and large, they've noticed some elevated metals in the livers of some of the critters out there, and I can't recall without one of these documents here to look at, but it's not, I think it's what they term as chronic low-level presence of metals as opposed to acute, which can kill after a very short exposure. In the past, we've seen some acute levels of copper that have killed fish upstream before the Warm Springs ponds up there were treated. As far as the wildlife here is concerned, I don't know. I wasn't around prior to 1907 or so when they started building this dam, but I imagine it was a riverbed pretty much like it is, 5 miles or so up towards Clinton. But after this dam was built, and after the railroad put in a dike or kind of a causeway going out there for their railroad spur that went into Bonner, those both created backwaters that essentially made a wetland, which was never here before. One of the things that everybody agonizes over is that if it turns out that a large part of the sediments should be removed or somehow treated, it'll probably disrupt those wetlands. But it's one of those things where it's a trade-off, I guess.
I think it's very clear from the data that's come out of studies done on the dam that the metals contaminated sediments that are behind the reservoir are having definite negative impacts on the Clark Fork River fishery, on aquatic life and the fish downstream. when the sediments in the reservoir get scoured out and they wash downstream, it causes violations of water quality standards for copper and zinc and other metals, and that's having long-term impacts on the fishery downstream, and those are the things that we want to see EPA and ARCO address in the Superfund cleanup, is making sure that those impacts don't occur in the future. We've had them long enough, and it's time to do something about it.
The reservoir not only provides habitat for wildlife, but recreational opportunities for local residents. Fishing, kayaking, and water skiing are a few activities that residents participate in.
What I'm saying is that the recreation has increased tremendously here. There's always been fishermen out here, particularly below the dam, but also up in the reservoir. And then a lot of people, more and more, are getting out and enjoying the wildlife. There's nesting areas up here, and one of the proposed plans is to develop a trail system and some other facilities around it and make it essentially, kind of a recreation center as well as being a Superfund site.
This is something that is going to enable this community to do better economically, and it's been proven in other communities where there's major trail facilities. So the bridge, certainly offers an opportunity not only to the people of this community, but Milltown as well. This bridge will eventually link with the Kim Williams Trail, which is the third component of the bicycle commuter network out of Missoula. And so you open, from someone in Missoula's perspective, perhaps come out here, open up the Patty Canyon recreational area, open up the Blackfoot Corridor area. But being a Bonner, Milltown, more specifically Piltsville resident for 21 years, this facility is for the people out here. People don't have places to walk. People don't have parks out here. People don't have places to recreate like you do in the city. You've got city parks, you've got trails. And so I think from the perspective of the folks that live out here, this is going to be a really wonderful place.
On the surface, the reservoir has been beneficial to human and animal residents, but the buried toxic sediments have posed a threat to wildlife and human health.
Milltown Dam is one that, again, has been extensively studied. In fact, I think we're well over $10 million in study cost on that one. And we've also expended some funds settling with the Milltown Water Users Association. That's a group of folks who found their groundwater affected by the buried sediments in the early 1990s. Those folks have a new water system, and we've done quite a bit of settlement with them to assure that not only they have a system for today, but they have a system in the future. But the big decisions on what we do to finalize the cleanup of the Clark Fork and the Milltown Dam are going to be happening here in the next year or so.
Well, ARCO did provide the people of Milltown with a new water supply when the arsenic contamination was discovered back in 1983, but there's been a lot of questions about whether that arsenic plume is stable or moving, and some of the data that have been collected since that time have suggested that that plume is actually migrating downstream and towards more water supply wells in the Milltown area. So right now I think that the water that folks in Milltown are drinking is safe, but I don't think there's any guarantees that that plume is going to remain stable and stay where it is, and I think there is threats to human health and drinking water in the Milltown and Bonner area if that plume starts to migrate, and no one has shown us data that definitively says that it's not going to migrate, and I think that's something EPA has a responsibility to address in their Superfund decision.
So the question remains, what should be done about the reservoir?
One of the significant aspects of the Milltown Dam is that it represents 15% of the tax base for School District 14. And so in 1998, MPC's holdings, which primarily are the dam, paid roughly $200,000 directly to Bonner School. And so through, I think one of our major concerns is that if the dam were to be removed, which we are in opposition to, that tax base would be lost. And so part of our discussions with ARCO is that we would establish an endowment that would pay in lieu of taxes for perpetuity that tax base to the school. The school couldn't afford to take that kind of a major hit.
Clearly, in discussions we've had with the people who live near the dam, they've expressed to us, and I think to the world, a strong desire to see the dam stay in place, because that's obviously a recreational area for the folks that live up there, and a nice recreational area, heavy usage, canoeist, etc. And so I think they've got, at least in some discussions we've had, some interest in the rubber dam concept. Every once in a while we hear from some folks downriver an interest in taking the dam out. Again, I find that, our view is that's kind of short-sighted. I guess if you're going to suggest take the dam out, I'm going to ask, my next question is going to be, and where would you like us to put the stuff?
Well, you know, there's the tax base issue is certainly the major issue. We understand that there's you know, problems associated with this being part of the Clark Fork Superfund issue, and the tail or the head of the dragon, whichever you want to call it. But the reservoir itself provides a number of educational and recreational opportunities out here that would be lost if the dam were to be removed. The wetlands would be gone. The rechannelization of both the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot would change the whole character, the integrity of this area forever. Even though the dam is a man-made structure, you know, historically it's been here almost 100 years, and it's created what you see out here today, that would be gone. So from an aesthetic point of view, from a recreational point of view, from an economic point of view, from an educational point of view, those things all come into play as to why we want to hang on to this for the community. One of our long-term goals on this site would be to potentially deal with some innovative technologies that would look at addressing the issues of the toxins that are in the sediments. Some technology that would allow for the removal of those without destroying what we have out here. And so we're looking for a win-win situation instead of just one that comes in and destroys you know, the entire area at the cost of what this place means to the community.
Bottom line is, the only way to prevent it is to remove all that stuff behind the dam. And a lot of people hate that idea. ARCO does, really expensive. It's technically tough to do. They say that in itself is going to create a huge impact. I admit it will. It will be a pretty large short-term impact to probably remove that stuff out of there. You're going to get flushes of contaminated sediment going downstream as you're mucking around behind the reservoir is a way to do it. But what's worse, having a short-term impact of some of the mud going downstream, or just leaving that stuff in a river forever?
Milltown's almost an easy one. I mean, as a practical matter, what we see happening out there is probably some modifications to the dam as it exists now to better handle sediment. And one of the proposals we've had from Montana Power Company, who owns the dam, is the use of something called a rubber dam, which just gives you a lot more flexibility in managing ice flows and sediment, you know, any kind of sediment loads. We do see the dam staying in place, and that's for some very, very practical reasons, cost being just one of them. But 6 million cubic yards of wet, sloppy sediment, I think is going to have a very difficult time finding a home in Missoula County, frankly. So I think as sort of just a practical, not only a difficult time finding a place to put it, but it would be extraordinarily difficult to handle, transport, etc. So you know, it's our feeling that the wisest thing to do to minimize exposure of people to the buried sediments, to minimize traffic accidents, to minimize the whole brain damage associated with finding a place to go with this stuff, is to continue to management where it is, improve our management technique, and then provide assurances that that dam will remain in place forever.
There's a lot of people who talk about impacts of removing the sediments, but it's our opinion that the confluence of western Montana's two major river systems is not a good place for a long-term hazardous waste repository, and that's how EPA and ARCO seem to be viewing the Milltown Reservoir site as a hazardous waste repository. We don't think it's a good repository. It's a dam that's reaching 100 years old now. There's been concerns about the stability of that dam and about scouring of sediments from out of the reservoir. So simply leaving things in place and doing nothing is not acceptable from our perspective, either from a human health aspect or from Clark Fork River water quality downstream. So we want to see something aggressive that addresses this problem once and for all, rather than leaving it and just hoping that things don't go sour there.
The fate of the reservoir is still being decided. People like Sandy Stash, Jeff Smith, Bob Benson, Bruce Hall, and Bruce Farling can offer information and direction on the issue, but it is ultimately up to the citizens of Milltown and the Clark Fork River Basin to decide.